Coming up on this episode of Crime Family.
This is part 3 of our Meredith Kercher murder case deep dive.
He says that the woman took out a knife and came up to him, telling him to get out of there. And then he says another man approached, and the woman told them both to hide their faces. The judge actually reinstated the convictions against them, so they're guilty again. So guilty, not guilty, and now they're guilty. Stuff got contaminated. That's when they found these trace evidence amounts of their DNA, so that's what they're talking about.
That even allowed?
Jesus, I don't know.
It's like you can't manipulate DNA to make it match to what you want it to match to.
They're just obsessed with her, like I said. They just want her to go down for this crazy ordeal narrative that they all created in their mind about her. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Crime Family. I'm your co-host, AJ, and I'm here with my two sisters, Stephanie and Katie. And this is part 3 of our Meredith Kercher murder case deep dive. So if you haven't listened to the first 2 parts, stop listening right now and go and take a listen to parts 1 and 2. So far, we've covered the initial crime scene and the police investigation that led to a false confession being given by Amanda Knox, who most of you will probably know her name at the very least. It was quite a high-profile case. So we've really kind of gone over a lot of the stuff about the crime scene, some of the evidence, and in-depth analysis of the interrogation of Amanda Knox by the police. So go ahead, take a listen. And in this part, we're going to be going deeper into the legal proceedings, including the trials of Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito. So without further ado, Katie's going to get it started.
Okay, so like we've talked about in previous episodes, the investigators in this trial had portrayed Amanda and Raffaele as killers, and they attacked their character for so long that to them it probably would have been embarrassing to admit that they had it all wrong from the beginning. And so this is why they just continued with the narrative that they were guilty. Also, as we explained previously, Rudy Gaday's trial was first, and in that case, the judge deliberated for 12 hours. So he only had a judge for his trial, not a jury. And so the judge deliberated for 12 hours and agreed with the prosecution that it was not just Rudy who had committed this crime, but that Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito were also involved. And the judge concluded that he could not know which one of the 3 killed Meredith, but decided that since they were all there and no one called for help or no one tried to stop it, meant that they all took part somehow, and the judge felt that they were all guilty. And so this was when Rudy was convicted and when the judge decided that Amanda and Raffaele needed their own trial as well. So I'm going to retrace some of our steps from the previous episodes just a little bit and go over some of the witness testimony and the defense's rebuttals to some of the testimonies so we can just get like a better sense of how their trial actually went down and clear some things up along the way. So the prosecution was convinced that Meredith's murder was the consequence of a sex game gone wrong, and they ultimately concluded that Amanda was the ringleader with Rudy and Raffaele following her lead. So this is the prosecution's theory of what happened that night. They say that Amanda and Raffaele met up with Rudy, and they claimed that they had all been smoking pot and probably drinking alcohol when they decided to all go back to Amanda's place to continue hanging out. There is evidence that both Amanda and Raffaele's phones were switched off before 9 p.m. that night, before they made their way over to Amanda's place. And once they arrived, the prosecution claims that Meredith confronted Amanda about not submitting her money for rent, and she scolded Amanda for bringing yet another strange man into their home. So Meredith probably knew Raffaele, as Amanda had been dating him for a week or so, but she may not have known who Rudy was. So she's just kind of like, who is this other, you're bringing another guy into our house kind of thing. They say that the two women began to argue and that the rage that Amanda had been holding in against Meredith finally broke out. And so
I was just saying, what rage against Meredith? So we've known each other for like 2 months. How can you have that much rage against someone?
Oh, I know. Like, what? Yeah, where's this rage coming from? I guess they were like very different people. I guess Meredith was very like studious and clean, like we talked about before. And Amanda was more of like messy and more of a free spirit. But I mean, why does that make you so angry? Because you're so different from somebody. And like they did get along. They were friends. So yeah, this is just them like totally just coming up with any excuse to, point their finger at Amanda. And so apparently Amanda wanted to teach Meredith a lesson since she was such a prude and always so serious about everything. And this is when they say Rudy goes to the bathroom while Amanda and Raffaele continue to confront Meredith in her bedroom. And as their arguments heat up, Amanda reaches out and bashes Meredith's head against the wall. And because Raffaele wanted to impress Amanda, he joined in on the attack. They say this is when Rudy comes back for the bathroom and he wanted to impress Amanda too, so he begins to attack Meredith to get Amanda's approval. So I really don't know where they come up with this idea that Amanda's like this ringleader and she's like just getting these guys to do whatever she wants them to do. Like it just seems like totally out of nowhere and just nothing to back that up at all.
What a ridiculous theory. It just comes out of nowhere. Like,
I know, it really is.
It's just stupid.
Yeah, it's crazy. And eventually they claim that Amanda and Raffaele threatened Meredith with a knife while Rudy sexually assaults her. And when Meredith started screaming, one of them panics and that's when her throat is slit. And Rudy then tried to stop the bleeding while Amanda and Raffaele take Meredith's phones to dispose of them while they flee the scene. And they say finally Rudy goes home, he changes his clothes, and he goes out to the clubs to try and establish an alibi for himself, while Amanda and Raffaele return to Amanda and Meredith's house to clean up the scene. This is when they try and make it look like someone had broken in, like we had talked about previously.
And I mean, that's even different than Rudy Gaday's original story, like that I think we went over in the last episode. Like when he first was arrested, like his theory was that like he went to the bathroom and then there was like an unknown person who said something to the effect of like they were going to frame him for this or something. So it's like funny how that entire story has just changed between that time and now the trial.
Yeah, because originally Rudy said Amanda wasn't even involved, but then kind of as time progressed, he changed his story to say, yeah, Amanda was there. So really don't know who did what and what happened at all at this point. So in January of 2008, a witness had come forward named Hukiran Kokamani, and he tells police that he was driving down the street near Amanda and Meredith's home on the night of the murder, and he noticed that there was something in the middle of the road, which he thought was a black garbage bag. When he got out of his car, he found out that it was actually a man and a woman just sitting in the street, and he said they seemed to both be, quote, off their heads. He says that the woman took out a knife and came up to him, telling him to get out of there, and then he says another man approached, and the woman told them both to hide their faces, but this witness claims that he had already seen them, and he even recognized one of them as Rudy Gaday. So this guy then gets back in his car and drives away, but it's when he saw the news about Meredith's murder, that's when he recognized the other two people on the road as Raffaele and Amanda. And another man had come forward as well in February of 2008, a homeless man named Antonio Curatulo, and he said that he saw Raffaele and Amanda hanging out at around 9:30 p.m. on the night of the murder in Pietra Garhana. think it's just like a park that's close to where Amanda and Meredith lived. And then he saw them again close to midnight before he left to go sleep in the park that night. Also, a local shop owner came forward and says that he saw Amanda come into his store at around 7:30 a.m. on the morning after the murder. And Amanda had claimed that she was asleep during this time previously. So I think this is supposedly when Amanda had gone out to buy bleach to clean up the scene or destroy evidence. And all of these sightings, of course, if they're true, then they would be significant to the prosecution's case, because they would debunk Amanda and Raffaele's story that they were at Raffaele's house the entire night, and it would be hard to look past that sighting of them with a knife in the middle of the road the night of the murder. If that happened, like, what would be the explanation for that? So it seems like this is kind of where the prosecution is coming from, all these witness sightings coming together.
Did any of these witnesses go on trial? Like, were they part of the trial for...
Yes, they testified.
Did they? Okay. I just wonder, like, because sometimes how you can be like an eyewitness could be several months later, and sometimes eyewitnesses they can't remember what they actually saw that night. So I was wondering if they actually went on trial and that was their actual story that they were sticking to, or it was like they thought that's what happened.
So at least one of them came forward. The murder happened November 2007, and they didn't come forward until early in 2008. But they were still called to testify at the trials.
Were they just lying then? Because, like, to me, it seems like kind of, it's like, well, by January of 2008, I mean, Amanda and Raffaele's faces have been plastered all over the news in a negative way. So are they just lying? Are they misremembering? Because, like, if all those sightings were true, like you said, it looks really bad for Amanda and Raffaele, but, you know, it's like that's, I mean, all the other stuff that the police kind of have is pretty weak. So if, like, these sightings are true, then that's kind of pretty compelling. But when you come forward 2 months after the fact, when these two people are already kind of seen as guilty, like, to me, it's a little suspicious, at least.
I was thinking, like, if you saw those two people in the middle of the street and one had a knife, you think you would report that to the police that night. That these two random strange people sitting in the middle of the road and one of them has a knife. That's something I would report anyway to the police so they could look out for them, not 2 months later after the fact.
Yeah, I don't know the whole explanation as to why he waited that long. I think one report said that he was just frightened and didn't want to get involved in whatever was happening there. But then it's when he kind of got caught up on the murder case and saw the faces of the people that were suspects, that's when he was like, oh, I actually saw them so on that the same night, so this is probably relevant. So, and I'm going to kind of get into what actually happened with these witnesses.
Oh, because I was going to say too, like, isn't there something, I don't know if it's the right term for it, but like in psychology, like hindsight bias or something? It's like, once you know the faces of the people who are suspects, then in your mind you like replace the real memory with like what you know or something. I don't know if that's a good explanation, but it's like kind of like a bias of like, oh, those were the people I saw, even if it really wasn't, but you're like filling in the blanks for yourself.
Yeah. And it's like if he was looking maybe at a lineup of people trying to figure out who he saw, he wouldn't be able to pick them out. But then once he saw their faces on the news and he had that same lineup, he'd probably be like, oh yeah, that's them. Even though it doesn't, he just thinks he recognizes them because, yeah, like you said, he saw those faces and he's trying to connect the dots.
Yeah.
That could happen to a lot of people in a lot of cases too.
I think it does, and I think that's why they don't always... Because you think eyewitness testimony is like, could be 100% because someone saw it with their own eyes, but actually it's oftentimes, like, eyewitness testimony is one of the worst because people don't remember things correctly. They, they make up things in their head that they convince themselves are true, and so, yeah, a lot of times it's just, you can't depend on what someone saw.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a lie detector test, like, because they're not admissible in court, so you can't really go off of what they say. So it's kind of like the same with eyewitnesses. You can't really 100% say that's what they saw because it could have been 2 months later or even like a couple days later. People don't remember exactly what they saw. I think
it depends on like the context or like the other information. It's like, I think eyewitness testimony is obviously very compelling, but it just depends on the situation. Like for this case, and a lot of what we know about this case is coming out after the fact. So like when you're in it, you don't really know all the level of corruption that's happening behind the scenes. So, I mean, maybe at the time he thought this witness was doing the right thing. Like, oh, I'm filling in the blanks for myself and these are the people. I'm going to help the police. But really, he's kind of just giving the police what they want to hear. So I think it depends, like, eyewitness testimony is credible, but depends on the situation and who it is and all the other pieces of information.
Yeah, and can you imagine if you're the prosecution and you're taking what these witnesses are saying as true, then there would be very little doubt, I think, in your mind that they were guilty, right? Because if someone says they legit saw them with a knife on that same night, then yeah, that looks pretty bad for them. And so them trying to like manipulate the DNA, even though of course that's not what you're supposed to do, but them in their mind, like, we have to get these people because it's so obvious that they did it. So you can kind of see where they're coming from, but I mean, it's still, once they get into it, you'll see that they just would not let it go even when they should have.
And also, it seems a little convenient too. Oh, these eyewitnesses happened to see them with a knife in the middle of the road that same night. Like, to me, it seems a little convenient. I don't know. But, and I guess, those random people that they saw on the street in the middle of the road with a knife are just completely unrelated. Just another group of people doing another murder that night. I don't know.
Yeah, that seems weird. It's like, if it wasn't actually Amanda and Raffaele and Rudy, then who was it? Maybe it was actually Rudy, because the guy said he knew Rudy and recognized him, so maybe it was some other guy and girl he was with that had a knife that night. So it's weird.
I don't think they ever found the real murder weapon, right? Like, in this case. They tried to say it was the knife they found at Raffaele's apartment, but I don't think they ever found it. So it could have been Rudy after he had killed Meredith with that same knife that he used to kill her in the middle of this road. Like, that could have been it. Just wasn't Amanda and Raffaele with him.
Yeah, exactly. It could have been. So like I was saying, with these eyewitness accounts, it does seem obvious why investigators were looking at Amanda and Raffaele so hard. But it was actually proven that these eyewitnesses were either lying or they were mistaken. So Hukuron Kokamani, who was known to have drug and alcohol issues, he actually described Amanda as having a gap in her front teeth, which she did not have. So I guess the woman he saw, or he thought he saw, had a gap in her front teeth, which doesn't match Amanda. And apparently he's the only person ever who saw Amanda, Raffaele, and Rudy together. And nobody else can ever say that they ever saw them together. And he testifies that it was raining the night that he saw the three of them, but it actually wasn't raining the night of the murder. So they think that he must have been mistaken on the night that he actually saw those people in the middle of the street with a knife. And Antonio's story would actually have provided an alibi for the time of the murders for Amanda and Raffaele. So that seemed to backfire on the prosecution, because they said that the murder took place, between like 9 and 11 or something, around that time, before midnight, on that night of November 1st. So if this guy saw Amanda and Raffaele in the park at 9:30 to midnight, then it's like, well, then they couldn't have been at the house murdering Meredith. So either way, it's just not working out for the prosecution, it seems. Also, there was no proof that Amanda had purchased bleach that morning at all. No receipts were found, and there was even a search done of the transactions at that store that claimed that Amanda was there. There was no record of any bleach being sold that morning at all. So that shop owner must have been mistaken on who he saw and when, because nobody bought bleach that morning, especially Amanda. And all the DNA evidence we talked about earlier, of course, the knife, the bra clasp, the mixed blood, the bloody footprints, they all proved to just be straight up wrong. And there was poor handling of the DNA and improper use of the lab equipment, which resulted in what the prosecution brought forward as DNA evidence. So we talked about all this in the previous episode. So all that DNA evidence, isn't really legitimate either.
I just, going back to like the misuse of the lab equipment, like I don't understand, like, who's working these laboratories if you don't know how to work it properly? I don't know. It always mishandled it. Like, how do you mishandle something that's so important?
Well, apparently it's like the lab people did their job improperly. It was more like they had such small traces of this DNA. It kept coming back as inconclusive or like too small to actually pick up any real DNA. And it was the prosecution that was pressuring them to, I guess, do other tests on them to like try and multiply the DNA that was there to get a bigger sample.
Oh.
And when they kept doing stuff like that, it's when they were finally like, oh, there is trace amounts of this DNA, but that's not standard protocol. Like, it kept coming back as, we can't find anything or it's not enough. And then finally, after they manipulated a bunch of things, stuff got contaminated. That's when they found these trace evidence amounts of their DNA. So that's what they're talking about.
Is that even allowed?
Jesus, I don't know.
It's like, you can't manipulate DNA to make it match to what you want it to match to. Like, that doesn't make any sense. DNA is DNA.
I remember we talked about in a different episode where there actually was like a method of looking at DNA where you could do something to it to try and make the sample bigger than it was, which is like a legit sort of method. But either, I don't know, if they just were doing it too many times, it was just not, I don't know, I guess it probably wasn't standard protocol. And just kind of things like that were happening, so.
Didn't they do that on the, like on the knife that they found in Raffaele's apartment? Like there was a small trace amount of Meredith's DNA on the blade, and so they like tried to do whatever process they do to like make the sample bigger. And then, yeah. So I feel like that's a thing, but also there's lots of stuff in this case that's like questionable and not allowed or not legal. So I mean, I wouldn't draw the line at anything that they do really, because clearly they don't really follow what is legal.
I feel like anybody could get away with murder these days if nothing ever, like the cops ever always do shady work. Like, I don't know, to me, every case that we've done, it's always been shoddy police work. So it's like, who knows what good police work is these days.
There are lots of examples of, you know, things not going the way they're supposed to. So it's kind of crazy. But, and yeah, I think it was on the blade of that knife where they did these manipulations of the DNA that they, or the samples that they thought were there, which finally came back to a trace amount of Meredith's DNA. But it wasn't like a legit thing that was typically done. So that's what I mean by like the lab doing things improperly. Also, we had previously discussed the break-in that night and how it seemed obvious that it was staged. So just a quick recap, it looked like a rock had come through Philomena's window, but they thought that it was staged, like someone had thrown it through the window afterwards just to make it look like a break-in, and there was all these little pieces of evidence that that's why they thought that. But there was also evidence that this may have actually been a legitimate break-in. And there's actual photos of Philomena's room with the rock and the broken window and detailed explanations of why it does look like an actual break-in. If you go to injusticeinperugia.org, so this is a website dedicated to this case, and they have lots of photos there. And some of the things they talk about are how the rock damaged the floor when it was thrown. There's pieces of the tile floor that were chipped up when the rock was thrown, and how it actually did do damage to the shutter when it busted through the window. So previously we had said that they looked at the shutters and said that, oh, there was no damage to the shutters, but there actually was. And you can see it in these pictures. And it shows that it looks like someone had stepped on the clothes that were lying underneath the window. So there's like dirt on these clothes. And there's photos that show it would have actually been easy to climb up that window, as the window below it had security bars on it that were looked like a perfect little ladder that could have easily been used by somebody. It's crazy to me that I've never come across these photos, or really any other sources that I've looked at really mention these pictures. And so I thought it was super interesting, and I looked through all the photos, and I have one here, that's showing this guy in his dress shoes climbing up this ladder underneath the window, and how easy it would be to do. So that to me is just kind of crazy. Yeah, I think they threw the rock through Philomena's window, climbed up the little ladder bars, and then Meredith was probably in her room, and that's where they went in. And then, yeah, they stole stuff out of her purse and stuff, stole her keys, left, closed the door, locked it, and then went out the front door.
Yeah, because I'm looking at all the pictures of that link that you sent with these photos, and yeah, it's weird that I've never seen these pictures before, and B, that, yeah, there's not really any sources out there that mention these. Obviously, maybe it came out during the trial and stuff, but the fact that these are pretty important photos that could tell a good story of what happened, or the truth of what happened, and it's never really, kind of just gets hush hush, because they have pictures, close-up pictures of the window with the shattered glass or the broken glass, and then they have the picture of the rock on the floor with the bag that it ripped as it went to the floor, and then pieces of the rock on the floor and the glass. So I feel it's interesting, and I think that the conclusion is that it's very unlikely that the break-in was staged, just based on the state of the room and these pieces of evidence. So just interesting that something that detailed and photos that could be that important were just sort of seen as an afterthought.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was crazy that I had never heard about these photos being out there or never seen them. Obviously, they exist, probably because they take photos of the crime scene, but it's just nobody ever really showed them before, which is kind of crazy. But super interesting to look at.
And also, couldn't they test the DNA on the rock? Like, the person who broke in, whose DNA is on the rock, could potentially be a good lead of who was involved. I don't know. But maybe it's too weird because, like, maybe lots of people's DNA would be on it. I don't know.
Maybe, or maybe they just couldn't get a good fingerprint or whatever from the rock. Because I would imagine they would have swabbed it for sure.
Yeah, I think some of the things that they're saying in the article with this photo too is that the police didn't do a thorough investigation of any of this stuff. Like, yes, they went in and took pictures of it, but there was a lot of missed information maybe that they didn't catch, and there's like shards of glass like near the bedside table and stuff. Like, I just think like a lot of missed opportunities here, but I guess that's just the story of this case. But I also can't tell if it's like incompetence or if it's like just willingly ignoring the evidence. Maybe a little of both. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, like you said, I think their conclusion was that this wasn't staged, because they would say if it was, like, would whoever staged it, presumably Amanda and Raffaele, would they have thought to, throw the rock hard enough so that it chipped the tile floor underneath where the rock hit the floor? And why does it look like someone stepped on those clothes underneath the window? And, like, why was the shutter busted, right? So it's just like, there's no way that somebody could stage all those things. I mean, there is, but, you wouldn't think about those kind of things when you were, like, in a rush trying to stage the crime scene. So I think the conclusion here is that, yes, somebody, Rudy, most likely, busted in through that window, and that's how we get in that night. So after 11 months of testimony, it was time for the jury to finally deliberate. And they found both Amanda and Raffaele guilty on December 5th, 2009. So Amanda was actually sentenced to 26 years in prison, and Raffaele was sentenced to 25 years. And I think she got an extra year because of that slander charge that she had against Patrick Lumumba. They added a year on because of that.
Oh my God. She didn't slander him, really. Like, she was led to that conclusion. Like, the police should have she should get a year taken off for that.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. In Italy, it's actually a law that anyone convicted of murder gets 2 appeals. So these are basically like additional trials after the fact to kind of like re-examine the case. So when Rudy was granted his first appeal, this time he claimed that Raffaele was the one who actually killed Meredith, and he said that Amanda was there as well. Regardless of whatever he said, ultimately both of his appeals were denied, and so his conviction of murder was upheld. And in November of 2010, Amanda and Raffaele's appeals started. So during the original trial, the defense had requested that an independent review of the DNA was conducted by a third party. So obviously this would be so that, like, if the investigators were the ones that were testing all the DNA, as we know, they did a shady job. And so the defense was like, well, can we have somebody that's impartial, like not on the defense's side, not on the prosecution side, to test this DNA? And that was actually denied. So they didn't have a third party come in and do that. And during the appeal, though, this request was actually granted. And this independent review backed up the defense's claims that the evidence was mishandled and that there were many instances of contamination. So like we said before, how shady things were happening, like this was actually backed up by a third party that looked at all the evidence and just looked at the pictures and how things were handled. So they came to that conclusion. The eyewitness that I talked about earlier, Antonio, he was actually brought back for the appeal. And this time he said that it was actually Halloween when he saw Amanda and Raffaele. So that was the night before the murders. And when the prosecution brought up the fact that Amanda was working on Halloween, so that actually didn't add up. And so they were probably thinking like, oh no, it wasn't Halloween. You probably did see them on November 1st. Antonio admitted that he was a heroin addict and he was high at the time that he saw them. So I guess, he probably really didn't know what day it was or what he saw. And so this is when the judge actually ordered him to leave the courtroom, and everything that he had to say was discredited. So it was like he really didn't know what he was talking about. And it took almost a year for the verdict to be determined in the appeal, which I find crazy. So after this trial, it was like a whole year before they could come to a conclusion.
A year? That's crazy.
I know. I don't know who's making this decision. Probably, I don't know if there'd be a jury in this appeal trial, but anyway. And on October 3rd of 2011, Amanda and Raffaele were both found not guilty, and they were cleared of the murder charges. And the judge ordered that they be released. So you think, oh, this is a happy ending, it's finally over for them. But no, it's not over. Even though they had been exonerated, the prosecution still could not get over the controversy that surrounded the DNA evidence. Like, they're so hung up on this. And they accused the judge of caving into the pressure of the U.S., and they said that the judge did not take into consideration any of the circumstantial evidence in the case. And the prosecution appealed the acquittal, and after a review by the Supreme Court, they actually overturned the acquittal, and they ordered a new trial.
That's crazy.
So their exoneration was, like, overturned, kind of. It's crazy. Like, it just keeps going.
Is, like, the concept of double jeopardy not a thing? Like, isn't that a thing where you can't be tried again for the same crime twice?
Yeah, that actually came up, and double jeopardy is not a thing in Italy. So you can be charged over and over again for the same crime, I guess, if they're willing to pursue it.
Well, like, so theoretically, they could just, like, create new fake evidence and then bring them back into trial a year later and do it all again. Like, to me, that's so bizarre.
Yeah, they could. Like, if they never want to give up on this, they could just keep going. Which kind of seems like that's what they were planning to do. And so there's another trial for Amanda and Raffaele. So in September of 2011, a new trial has begun, but at this time, at least, the media attention has died down a little bit. And after they were acquitted the first time, like, Amanda got the hell out of Italy, obviously. She went back to the US with her family. They actually didn't have to physically be in court for this retrial, because I guess it was just like a rehashing of all the evidence. So that's a good thing. Like, she didn't have to be dragged back into court or into jail during the retrial. So at least that's a little bit of comfort for them while this trial took place. So in January of 2014, the judge actually reinstated the convictions against them. So they're guilty again. So guilty, not guilty, and now they're guilty.
That's crazy. I was thinking, like, Amanda's back at home, but, like, she doesn't really feel like she can really relax. Like, I mean, you imagine you're back at home, but you know that at any minute you could be, like, charged again or, like, convicted again of the thing. So it's like she's home, but I mean, it probably didn't give her much comfort. I guess it's better than being in a jail in Italy, but still.
Yeah, like, at least she was home, but yeah, she could have been extradited back to jail in Italy if this was upheld. In 2015, the High Court, which is like the Supreme Court, concluded that the original investigation was heavily flawed and tainted by the media. And this case was actually thrown out, and they demanded that they were both be fully exonerated again, which is what happened. And so Amanda's conviction of slander, though, against Patrick Lumumba was upheld. So it's not over for Amanda. So after all this, like, Amanda actually goes back. Like, she herself appealed that conviction. And so she would actually be heading back to court. So in October of 2023, she tweeted, quote, "I'm on trial in Italy again, and this is a good thing," end quote. And she was actually exonerated of these slander charges as well. But when she was exonerated, the court ordered a new trial for these slander charges. So like I said, it's really never ending.
Oh my God, they're just, like, obsessed with her.
I know, like, they really, really want her to go down for something. And so in an article by Euronews.com, they say that if she is found guilty again for slander, she's not going to face any additional prison time. I guess, like, she's done her time. She's not going to go back to prison, but she'll just have a conviction on her record still if she is found guilty. So, I mean, she can, like, stay where she is. She's free. But it's just a matter of clearing her record, I guess. So, I mean, I don't think that we know the outcome of that. Because that was October of 2023. So, I couldn't find anything about if she actually was found guilty again of slander.
But, like, the slander thing is stupid because, like I said, the police created that narrative. Like, how did she slander? I guess the false confession, but we know all the information about the false confession, like, you know.
I know. Can she sue, like, Italy for all the slander against her? Like, I'd be going after the media if I was her. Go after the prosecutors. Like,
Yeah.
dragging her name for the mud for years. Like, it just seems crazy that they're, this fucking slander case. They won't give up on it.
Yeah, like it's crazy to me that like they can create this narrative through all this like the false confession and the interrogation and all that, and then turn around and charge you for slander when it was you. Like, they know what they did. They know it's not slander. They're just obsessed with her, like I said. They just want her to go down for this crazy ordeal narrative that they all created in their mind about her. So it's just wild to me. I've never really seen, I mean, I've seen the media, like, or the police target someone, obviously, but I've never really seen it similar in this way, where it's like they're just so determined that it's like, no, they're going to get her for something, no matter how many times we have to bring her to trial, no matter how many charges we have to lay against her, like, she's going to go down for something. Like, to me, I've never really seen it to that extent before.
Because so stuff like this doesn't like happen in the U.S. Like we were saying, like being exonerated and then retried and then exonerated. Like those things don't happen because I guess in Italy you can.
Yeah, you can't because double jeopardy, right? Once you're convicted of a crime, you can't be convicted of that same crime. Once you're exonerated, you can't go to trial again for the same thing. Like, but in Italy they don't have that law, so it's just like they can just keep appealing and then getting it thrown out, overturned, go back to trial like over and over again. So
it just sucks for her because like her name will never be out of the spotlight. Well, even today, because we're talking about it still. But someone like Patrick, like his life was also upturned, but he moved away and whatever and moved his family away so he didn't have to deal with that. But she's still, today, reliving it and having to answer questions about what happened that day. Like, it's just hard for her to be out of the spotlight completely.
Yeah. And it just, I think it too, I was going to say, it sucks. I mean, it sucks that it happens to her or to anyone at any time, but it also must really be the worst is that it's like happened in another country where they have different laws. Because even if that same thing happened in the States, which we've seen it happen, we know what happens. The police are corrupt everywhere. But if it had happened in the States, like that one exoneration would have been done, right? Like that's it. So it's like worse, obviously, that it happened overseas in a country that has those different laws because like she can be tried as many times as they feel they want to.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I think one thing that's really different as well as everybody, if you're convicted of murder, you have the right to 2 appeals, which I don't think is a thing here. Like, 'cause you can apply for an appeal, but they can like shut that down, and some people can never get an appeal, I think, here and in the US. Like, that's not a thing. So that's one major difference for sure.
I was always under the impression you can have more than one appeal, but maybe you can't. I thought like you could have one appeal and then like you couldn't do it for a few years down the road. You could do another one, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's not a thing here.
I don't know. I think you can have multiple appeals here, but you have to there has to be like new evidence or somebody comes forward or something. You don't just automatically get an appeal. Is that right? I feel.
Yeah, I think that's true. I feel like you can have as many appeals. Like, I don't think there's a limit on the appeals, but there has to be some reason for the appeal. Like, it either has to be new evidence or it has to be, like, new proof that the original verdict was flawed or the original trial was flawed or something. Like, you have to come to the table with some type of new information that would, like, trigger that appeal to be approved, I think. Like, I don't think you can just appeal an appeal on the same basis.
But in Italy, you don't have to. You can have appeal after an appeal.
Yeah, everybody has the right to at least 2 appeals. But I've heard like of cases in the US and Canada where it's like they say that their appeals have been exhausted. So there definitely is a limit whether new evidence comes up or not, I guess. I think and appeals are different than like a retrial, right? Because if you think that because an appeal would just be like, oh, that conviction is overturned, but a retrial would be like, well, let's do it again. Because something happened the first time. You're not necessarily exonerated. So there's really 2 different things that I think we're getting mixed up.
I think like maybe like when you say they've exhausted their appeals, because I've seen that too, maybe it means just like they've exhausted the amount of things they could potentially come up with as being flawed. Like, like you can do an appeal based on a mistrial or like that the trial was flawed, or you can do an appeal based on the fact that the evidence was skewed or whatever. But like maybe after you like get denied all those, it's like, okay, well, there's no more avenues to pursue for an appeal. Maybe that's what that means. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but
Yeah, there's no appeal, but there's but you could get a retrial.
yeah.
That's not the same as an appeal. Because an appeal would be like, oh, yeah, actually you are not guilty, so you're out of jail. And a retrial would be like the first trial, you had your lawyer was really shitty, or not all the evidence was brought forward. So we're not saying you're guilty or not guilty, but we're going to do a new trial. So that's not an appeal. That's a new trial. And I think that can happen as long as there's enough compelling evidence that they haven't brought forward.
I think so maybe not an appeal, you're appealing the verdict, the final verdict, but then a retrial is I guess you're still contesting the verdict, but I don't know what I'm trying to say. If you do an appeal, it's okay, we're going to appeal that this was a faulty verdict, but in a retrial, it's we're going to just forget that was the verdict and we're just going to start from scratch and do a retrial kind of thing, right?
Well, I think a retrial is they found new evidence, or they saw something that wasn't quite right in the first time, so they're going to retry it and see.
Yeah, or there's something wrong with the jury or something. The jury was tainted, and then they just need to do the whole trial again, but with a new jury. That kind of thing, I think. So yeah, you're starting over. Not guilty, not guilty. But an appeal, they could say, yeah, you're right. You actually aren't guilty, I think. So
they're kind of similar, though. They're very similar if you think about it. They're both changing the outcome of what could actually happen, or what did happen.
I think a appeal is easier to get than a retrial, I think. A retrial is a whole big thing where it's they have to bring in jurors, new jurors, do the whole thing again. So I feel you're much less likely to get granted a retrial than you are to get an appeal. I think it's still hard to get an appeal, but I don't know.
I feel, because an appeal, I feel would be a harder decision because you're not going through a retrial. It's yeah, I'm going to make the decision for you to not be guilty. So see you later. Whereas a retrial, you have to do all the work again, but it's not the judge just being you're not guilty, right? It's well, let's just try it again kind of thing.
Oh, yeah. I guess, yeah.
Yeah, here, I looked it up, so I will read what it says here at the Bar Association, or the AmericanBar.org. So it says, an appeal is not a retrial or a new trial of the case. The appeals courts do not usually consider new witnesses or new evidence. Appeals in either civil or criminal cases are usually based on arguments that there were errors in the trial procedures or errors in the judge interpretation of the law. But that's what a retrial would be.
But I feel well, no, I think as an appeal, it's they're just they're still using the same evidence in the same trial.
Yeah.
But saying oh, that this was wrong, versus a retrial where they'd bring in new witnesses, new lawyers potentially, or new jury.
Yeah, a retrial is they bring in, if they find new evidence, or someone came forward that didn't come forward before, or yeah, new judges or new lawyers and stuff.
Yeah, it's not new evidence for an appeal. It could be people get appeals because they say their rights were violated, or they didn't read the Miranda rights or something, or they didn't understand their rights, and so the whole thing gets thrown out on a technicality like that. So that would be an appeal.
Okay, so I guess in that way it is probably harder to get an appeal.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're less likely to throw out the whole thing. They'd more likely want to just redo a retrial, especially if they're confident that on a retrial you're still going to be found guilty. So I guess you can't just present new evidence for an appeal. That would be for a retrial, right? The appeal has to be based on what happened in the original trial, using the same evidence, same everything. You just have to prove oh, this is a technicality, or oh, this was an error, or error in judgment, or something. I don't know.
Yeah, that is what the appeal is. It's I got found guilty because somebody made this mistake, or I didn't understand something, or they did something wrong. But they're not going to show you new evidence as to why you're not guilty. That would be the retrial. So, yeah, I learn something new every day. I thought I had my head around it, but now I feel I do.
Yeah, and clearly we're not legal experts, so maybe you learned something in this conversation too.
I also feel that retrials are also not that common either, because that's a lot of resources being used again to retry somebody for the same murder that happened, or same crime, or whatever it may be. So I feel there's not too many retrials out there either.
Yeah, I don't think it's super common.
Yeah, I feel like either avenue, like an appeal or retrial, is like very slim that you would even be granted an appeal or granted a retrial.
Interesting. Obviously, yeah, we're not lawyers, so we don't know anything about the law.
Yeah, clearly we just had a 10-minute discussion about an appeal versus a retrial. So,
I know.
yeah, we're not experts. So yeah, that's where we're going to end it for this part. And in our final part, we're going to kind of go into, I mean, we kind of reviewed like sort of the outcome in this case and all of that, but we're going to get into more of the specifics about the media's impact on this case, because I think that's a really important part that we haven't really dug that deep into. We kind of mentioned it in passing that the media spun certain things, but we have a couple of examples of like the way that the media treated Amanda and all of that sort of stuff, and a couple of examples of the police misconduct in this case as well. And then a little bit into the aftermath and, you know, where all of these players in this case are now, and what they're up to, and all of that stuff. And we're going to continue our discussion of the case, so you can join us for that next week. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We're on all the social medias. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, Crime Family Podcast. We're on X at Crime Family Pod 1. You can get merch for the show at the link in our show notes. You can support the show with buying some Crime Family swag. You can also become a patron of the group. If you join our Patreon page as a paid member, you can get bonus episodes, ad-free content, and early access to our episodes. So very excited about that. So all of the links to that are going to be in the show notes. Send us an email at crimefamilypodcast@gmail.com with case suggestions or feedback about our deep dive. We're on YouTube as well, so you can subscribe to us at Crime Family Podcast, listen to all our episodes on there, leave comments, all that good stuff. We'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much. Join us next week for part 4 of the Meredith Kercher murder case. And until then, see ya.
Bye.
Bye.